Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of history's most chilling, genuinely unsolved mysteries, the Dyatlov Pass incident. We're keeping things very methodical today, focusing strictly on the investigation, the evidence, and the unanswered questions. Honestly, there's no need for sensational dramatics here, because the actual, documented facts are plenty strange all on their own. We're going to break down the investigation, dig into the physical evidence, and really look closely at the massive gaps that still remained.
Picture this. It's February 1st, 1959. 9 incredibly experienced hikers pitched their tent on the eastern slope of a mountain that the local indigenous Mansi people called Avalanche. Translated, that literally means Death Mountain. Now, maybe they didn't know that name yet, or maybe they just figured seasoned hikers don't need to worry about local folklore. But by the time the sun came up, all 9 of those hikers would be dead. And over 6 decades later, nobody truly knows why.
Section 1, the Death Mountain Expedition, a journey for the experts. Let's just quickly set up the timeline here, because understanding exactly who these victims were is absolutely crucial to grasping why their final actions make zero logical sense.
So the group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute over in Soviet Russia. He planned this whole trip with 8 fellow students and a sports instructor. And let's be clear, these guys were not beginners. The route they mapped out was graded the highest difficulty level available at the time. They actually specifically asked for that classification. 10 people started out, but on January 28th, Yuri Yudin had to tap out because his knee was acting up. He hugged his friends goodbye and ended up living until 2013. He actually later said that surviving was the worst thing that ever happened to him. The remaining 9 went on to pitch their tent on Kholatsyakhl on February 1st. When they failed to send a scheduled telegram back to their sports club, an official search party was finally launched on February 20th.
Before we get into what that search party actually found, we really need to anchor ourselves in the visceral reality of this environment. On that night of February 1st, temperatures on the mountain were hovering around -40 degrees Celsius. Think about that for a second. We are talking about an extreme, unforgiving, totally brutal level of cold where human survival is measured in minutes, not hours.
Section 2, a baffling frozen crime scene. The surface evidence. Okay, let's fast forward to February 20th when the searchers arrived, because what they found on the surface was just completely illogical.
The whole scene was basically a series of baffling discoveries. First up, they find the tent. But it hadn't been unzipped. It had been slashed open from the inside. Multiple cuts. It's like they had to escape immediately and couldn't spare even a single second to find the zipper. Then, radiating away from that slashed tent were 9 sets of footprints. And here's the crazy part. Those tracks were left by people wearing only socks, maybe a single shoe, or were just completely barefoot, in -40 degrees snow. Following those tracks, about 1.5 kilometers down to the edge of the woods, they found the first bodies under a massive pine tree. After that, they found 3 more bodies scattered on the slope between the tree and the tent, literally frozen in poses that made it look like they were desperately trying to crawl back to their abandoned gear.
Let's look a little closer at those first 2 bodies found under the pine tree, Krivoshenko and Doroshenko. They were completely shoeless, dressed only in their underwear. Now, they both died of hypothermia, but the details just do not fit a simple freezing scenario. Krivoshenko had 3rd-degree burns. You can't sustain those if you just fall asleep by a campfire while alive, right? Plus, he had bitten off a piece of his own knuckle. Was he trying to stay awake? Or maybe trying to stifle a scream? To make it even weirder, the branches of that Siberian pine tree above them were snapped off up to 5 meters high. Someone had scrambled desperately up that tree. Were they looking for their slashed tent in the dark? Or watching for whatever drove them out of it in the first place?
Section 3. The ravine autopsy anomalies. The deep evidence. So the mystery gets even deeper a few months later, when the last 4 bodies were finally discovered.
They weren't found until May, when the snow melted and a local Mansi hunter spotted them buried under 4 meters of snow down in a ravine. And this find brilliantly illustrates the central paradox of this entire crime scene. When the medical examiner looked at these 4 bodies, they found a totally impossible contrast. On the outside, pristine skin. No cuts, no bruises, no scrapes corresponding to any kind of trauma. But on the inside, catastrophic destruction. Several of the hikers had crushed chests and skulls. The forensic examiner even noted that the force required to cause those specific internal injuries was comparable to a high-speed car crash. But there was no car. There was no cliff they had fallen off. Something literally crushed them from the inside.
And the specific anomalies from the autopsy are incredibly haunting. 20-year-old Ludmilita Dubina was found completely missing her tongue and her eyes. Another hiker, Slobodin, suffered blunt force skull trauma, and the examiner explicitly went on record stating it could not be attributed to clumsiness or a simple fall. Someone or something struck his head. Oh, and then there was the clothing on these last 4 bodies. Tests actually revealed radiation. The levels were high enough to be officially documented in the files, yet low enough to remain totally ambiguous as to where it even came from.
Section 4. The official Soviet investigation. A chilling conclusion. Faced with this impossible collection of evidence, how did the Soviet government respond in May of 1959?
They officially closed the case using this exact chilling phrase as the cause of death, an unknown compelling force. They didn't call it an avalanche, they didn't call it a bear attack or even exposure, just an unknown compelling force. And right following that verdict, the Soviet government locked the files away in a vault and sealed them for 30 years.
Naturally, sealing the files only poured gasoline on the public's desperation for answers. Over the next 6 decades, more than 75 different theories were rapidly investigated. First, the local Mansi people were suspected, but they were quickly cleared. Witnesses reported seeing strange orange lights in the sky, fueling theories of a secret Soviet weapons test gone terribly wrong, or a massive KGB operation cover-up. Some scientists proposed infrasound, this idea of low-frequency wind vibrations causing severe panic and hallucinations. And yes, even a Yeti attack was proposed, which sounds absolutely ridiculous until you remember that people were desperately trying to explain how a human chest gets crushed without breaking the skin.
Section 5. The modern avalanche theory. The 2021 Scientific Review. Let's bring this explainer right into the modern era.
So, Russia officially reopened the case in 2019, and in 2021, a highly respected peer-reviewed study came out from Swiss researchers at ETH Zurich. Their conclusion? The most likely culprit was a slab avalanche. Now, this is a very specific type of snowslide that can actually happen on relatively shallow slopes, kind of like the one where they pitched the tent. Unlike loose snow, a slab avalanche hits with the blunt, crushing force of a solid block of ice. Using advanced computer simulations, the researchers proved that a slab avalanche striking the tent could absolutely cause those car crash-like internal injuries we saw in the ravine entirely without leaving external cuts. It's a highly credible, super solid scientific theory.
Section 6. Unanswered questions still remain. Testing the scientific theory. Now, what's really interesting here is how we can systematically stress test that modern scientific theory against the hard physical evidence that's still left over.
Because even those Swiss researchers stopped short of claiming the mystery was totally solved. Let's look at the cross-examination. Does a slab avalanche explain the crushed chests and skulls? Yes, the computer models prove it's totally possible. But does an avalanche explain Ludmila Dubinina's missing tongue and eyes? Well, no. Avalanches don't carefully remove tongues. Scavenging animals were suggested. But remember, she was buried under 4 meters of snow for months, and the surrounding tissue showed absolute zero signs of animal activity. Does an avalanche explain the radioactive clothing? Nope, avalanches are definitely not radioactive.
But honestly, perhaps the biggest question the avalanche theory completely fails to answer comes down to basic human behavioral logic. Why flee without shoes? Seriously, put yourself in that minus 40-degree scenario. Even if a massive block of snow hits your tent, even in a blind, terrified panic, grabbing your boots takes exactly 3 seconds. These weren't panicked amateurs. They were highly trained winter survival experts who had prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. And yet, they slashed their tent open and ran into the freezing night barefoot.
Which brings us right to today. Even now, in 2025 and moving into 2026, independent expeditions to Death Mountain continue. Relatives of those hikers are still out there actively petitioning the government to reopen the criminal investigation. We're still seeing new forensic analyses of the tent site trauma being published. The case has never officially been closed. It just sits in this weird state of suspension, periodically reopened, debated by modern science, but never fully, actually resolved.
The avalanche theory might explain the blunt force trauma, sure, but it completely ignores the radiation, the missing anatomy, and the fundamental psychology of survival experts. Whatever happened on that slope on the night of February 1st, 1959 was terrifying and fast enough that 9 highly experienced people couldn't spare 3 seconds to grab their shoes before bolting into minus 40-degree snow. So what was it? The truth is, 67 years later, we still just don't know.